Before we get into the issue of philanthropy, in particular philanthrocapitalism and the Gates Foundation, let us start with your personal motivation. What sparked your interest to pursue research in this field?
It's a great question. I mean, I've been looking at philanthropic foundations, and particularly the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, for almost more than 10 years now, starting from when I had a research fellowship at Oxford, actually, after finishing my PhD, and I was casting around for a new research topic, and I was looking at the area of neglected disease research. So how you get pharmaceutical companies to devote some of their resources to spending on health ailments that tend to afflict people in developing regions. So there's not necessarily a huge market for the development of new therapies because the recipients can't necessarily pay a lot of money for it. And this brought me into contact with the Gates Foundation and some of its work in global health that was eliciting considerable praise and ways from some institutions and some actors, but also a lot of concerns from other global health actors. So I saw it as a key sociological conundrum. Why is this organization seen as so divisive? How can we understand both its pros and its negatives when it comes to some of its global health funding?
I want to set the stage a bit further and talk about certain terms and definitions and concepts. You mentioned the criticisms, and one of the terms that you use in your book is called philanthrocapitalism. People, in my opinion, I didn't know about philanthrocapitalism, and I mixed up philanthropy with philanthropism. I guess that's how many people feel. So can you talk about what the difference is between philanthropy and philanthrocapitalism, and how the practice of philanthrocapitalism has evolved historically up until this current period?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I'll try not to give too long a response because it's quite a complex area, but to really break it down, I'll have to go into some of these definitions in depth. So this term philanthrocapitalism, I mean, like you, when I first heard it, I thought it was quite a jarring term, a jarring phrase, and it was not one that I had coined. It's not my own phrase. It's one that I study as an academic. And it was coined about 15 years ago now by a gentleman named Matthew Bishop, who works at The Economist, who worked at the time at The Economist magazine. He no longer does. He was an editor at The Economist. And I'm not sure if your readers or your listeners are that familiar with The Economist, but it's seen generally as quite a center to center right magazine that tends to report upon the activities of the global economy, but has tended to do so in a way that's generally favorably disposed towards capitalist expansion and capitalist development. So it's a very pro-capitalist magazine. And this term philanthrocapitalism was defined in two different ways. It's been defined really in a plethora of ways, but here are some of the key ways that Bishop sees it. First of all, he said that it could be defined as what he saw as the new tendency for organizations like the Gates Foundation to try to emulate the practices of the for-profit sector in their own giving practices. So to try to increase their efficiency and their cost effectiveness, in theory anyways, by making their business practices more corporate in nature, by sort of having a real fixation on results and impact and being able to measure the efficacy of their donations, the ability to create good. And then he also argued, and I think this is particularly controversial, but Bishop and some of his peers have argued that the term philanthrocapitalism gets at the idea that capitalism is itself, by its nature, a naturally philanthropic mode of economic development because it creates dynamism and wealth that leads naturally to benefits for a wider community. And personally, as someone who was quite critical of unfettered, under-regulated capitalistic expansion, I was very critical of the idea that you could see capitalism as a naturally altruistic or philanthropic phenomenon because it creates an incentive to hoard profits rather than disperse them.
I want to move back to the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. I think it's essential to analyze Bill Gates as well to understand how this foundation got most of its wealth, or maybe the starting point of its wealth. Before Bill Gates stepped down as a CEO or chairman, the corporation was fined numerous times for monopolistic activities. For example, in the United States in 2000, Microsoft was almost broken up, but a settlement was reached. In the EU, it was ordered a fine of almost $800 million in 2004, and then it was fined almost $900 million for not complying for this initial fine from 2004. In 2013, it was fined by the European Commission by $730 million. And of course, there's this well-documented issue of tax avoidance schemes that Microsoft used and is still using in Luxembourg, Ireland, or Puerto Rico. In addition, there's this issue of lobbying. I found a very interesting article on CNN from 2002 with the title, How Microsoft Conquered Washington, in which it outlines how Microsoft quickly learned from its failures when it was almost broken up in 2000. And then it stepped up its efforts in lobbying. In 2019, Microsoft spent around $10.2 million in lobbying. So the question is, putting philanthropic capitalism as a concept with Bill Gates Foundation, how can a person who's had to run a corporation with these practices all of a sudden make a switch when he does philanthropy? Don't you think that philanthropy is just a tool which still carries over these practices from the corporate world over into the charitable world?
I think it's a really important question. And I think it's one that increasingly in today's world is not being asked enough. Whereas if you look back 100 years, the very questions that you're asking used to be asked of the predecessors to Mr. Gates, like Andrew Carnegie and John D. Rockefeller, who also set up large foundations with their wealth. And these were very wealthy early American industrialists who made fortunes in both the sort of rail industries, the oil, and the steel industries, okay? So Carnegie was seen as sort of the steel baron, and Rockefeller, the big oil baron of the United States, setting up Standard Oil. And when they went to the public and said, you know, praise us, view our activities favorably because we're going to give our money away, actually the public wasn't convinced because they wanted those men to invest in more worker-friendly business practices rather than essentially exploit their laborers while their wealth was made and then think it was possible to sort of cleanse their conscience by giving the money away later on. And I think the same can be said to a certain extent, to a very large degree, of the Gates Foundation. Because I think even putting aside some of these anti-competitive findings that the Justice Department and other organizations like the European Commission reached about Microsoft, leading to these huge fines that you've just announced. So we have to realize what these fines are. They're an indication of illegal activity, anti-competitive activity, which has always been regulated because of the fear that you have to keep large businesses, you have to restrain them from becoming too large monopolies that essentially start to threaten the democratic process and the ability to regulate these organizations for the common good. That's why we have antitrust legislation in different regions in Europe and the United States and Canada. That's why we try to restrict monopolistic practices, because it's harmful for consumers and it's harmful for other businesses. It's actually the opposite of competitive business activity, which capitalism is, in theory, supposed to promote. But also, I think one of my biggest concerns with how Microsoft operated and continues to operate is that it really embraced the contract worker bonanza, where, you know, they were the forerunners of what we call in the United Kingdom now the sort of zero protections gig economy, where you never know what hours you're working, you have no sick pay, you have no chance of a long-term retirement benefit once your job is deemed expendable or when you're older. So you've got all these reductions in worker protections through the emergence of the contract worker economy. And Microsoft in the 80s and the 1990s, so 20, 30 years ago, was really at the forefront of hiring in these sort of armies of temporary workers who did not have adequate worker protections. So when something like COVID hits today, and Mr. Gates is saying, I think quite rightly, he's trying to help, and we can come to that later. I don't subscribe to all these conspiracy theories who see him as this sort of evil character determined to profit from harming people. I think that's just horrendous. That's another extreme and really prevents the type of cautious criticism that I think needs to be made. So he's not deliberately trying to harm people in any way. But I think while he was in business, while he was CEO of Microsoft and later the chairman, he should have done more to make sure that that corporation had better worker protections than he did for its so-called less skilled temporary workers. These are often essential workers who are not treated as fairly as they should be.